The invitation had come on a Tuesday, and Eloan Ashby had read it 4 times before she let herself believe it. The card was heavy-edged in gilt, the kind of paper that cost more than a housemaid earned in a season. The words were engraved rather than written, as though the union they announced had already been carved into something permanent, something that could not be argued with. Miss Delphine Ashby to Alaric Trevanion, Duke of Merrow. At the chapel of Merrow Court, the 14th of September. She had read her sister's name first, and it had made her smile. Then she had read the second name, and the smile had frozen on her face the way frost creeps over still water, slowly, and then, all at once, Alaric Trevanion, the Duke of Merrow. Him. For 3 years, she had trained herself not to think that name. She had folded it away like a letter one cannot bear to burn and cannot bear to read, and she had gone to the far side of the country and become a paid companion to an elderly widow in Bath, and she had built a small, quiet, colorless life in which that name did not exist. And now it sat in the middle of a wedding card, in her sister's careful, joyful hand, and it was going to marry Delphine. She could have refused to come. She had told herself, all the long weeks after, that she should have, but Delphine had written beneath the engraving, in ink, "Please, Ellie, I cannot be married without you there. You are all the family I have that ever loved me." And that was the one sentence in the world. Eloan Ashby had never learned how to refuse, so she came. The road to Merrow Court ran along the cliffs, and the sea came into view all at once the way it always did in Cornwall, a great gray shoulder of water heaving under a low sky, gulls screaming somewhere out past the headland. The carriage smelled of damp leather and salt. Eloan kept her gloved hands folded in her lap and watched the hedgerows go by thick with the last of the summer's flowers, and told herself the tightness in her chest was only the sea air. Then the house rose up out of the land, and her breath left her entirely. Merrow Court was grander than she had let herself remember. It stood on a rise above a cove, a long, pale house of weathered granite, with tall windows that caught the flat light and threw it back like sheets of pewter. Ivy climbed the eastern wing. Below it, terraced gardens fell away toward the water, in green shelves, and she could see, even from here, that someone had planted the long beds along the drive thick with forget-me-nots past their flowering now, this late in the year, only a stubborn late bloom here and there still showing blue among the green. She had to look away from those. There'd been forget-me-nots once, in another life, crushed warm in a young man's fist, but that was a door she had nailed shut, and she did not open it now. The carriage drew up on the gravel with a long, grinding sigh, and a footman in Merrow livery handed her down. And for a moment Eloan simply stood there in her plain traveling gown, a small figure with dark hair and gray-green eyes, feeling the whole vast house look down at her. The wind came up off the cove, smelling of salt and cut grass and the green rot of the tide line, and somewhere below the terraces, a bell was tolling the hour, slow and iron and sad. She had rehearsed this arrival 100 times on the long road down from Bath. She knew exactly how it would go. She would be calm. She would be plain and useful and invisible. The poor elder sister come to see the fortunate younger one wed, and no one would look at her twice, and that would be a mercy. I can do this, she thought. A week. I will smile at my sister. I will stand beside her while she weds, and I will never once let him see that it costs me anything at all. A week, and then I go home, and this place goes back to being a name I do not think. She did not see the child until the child was already beside her. She was small, 5, perhaps 6, in a white pinafore gone gray at the hem with a tangle of dark hair no nurse had managed that morning. She had come around the side of the steps with the silence of something wild, and she stood now looking up at Eloan with enormous solemn eyes, saying nothing at all. "Hello," Eloan said softly, because one said hello to children. "And who might you be?" The child did not answer. She only went on looking, her small face grave and searching, as though Eloan were a page in a book she had been trying to read for a very long time, and had only now, at last, begun to understand. There was something in the look that did not belong on a face so young. A kind of recognition, though they had never met, though they could not possibly have met. A gull cried out over the roofline. The child did not flinch. She only tilted her head, watching, waiting, as if for something Aloan was supposed to know how to give. "She won't answer you, miss." A harried young nurse came hurrying down the steps, cheeks pink with embarrassment. "Lady Wren doesn't. That is, she doesn't speak. Hasn't, not since. I'm so sorry, miss." She slips away from me. "Come along, my lady, come away and let the lady be." But the child did not come along. Instead, with a gravity that stopped the nurse mid-reach and stopped the breath in Eloan's own throat, the little girl reached up and slid her small cold hand into Eloan's gloved one, and held on and would not let go. The nurse's name was Jenna, and she was near to tears. "You mustn't mind it, miss," she whispered, as they went up the steps with the child walking small and stubborn between them, her hands still locked in Eloan's. "She takes to no one, not to the Duke's own mother, not to the maids she's known since she could walk. She's not spoken a word in 2 years, miss, not since the old duchess, since her mother passed the doctors from London came and went and shook their heads. And now she'll not so much as let go of a stranger's hand." Jenna looked genuinely frightened. "I don't know what's come over her." Eloan looked down at the small dark head beside her. "Perhaps," she said gently, "she is only tired of being managed. Children can tell, you know, when they are a problem to be solved." She did not know why she said it. She only knew that when she did, the child's fingers tightened around hers just once, as though something had been understood. They came into the great hall, a cold cavern of a room, stone-floored, hung with the dark portraits of dead Trevanians, all of them severe, none of them smiling. And there the household had assembled itself in the loose, curious way that households do when something new arrives. Maids paused with their arms full of linen. A butler inclined his head, and near the foot of the staircase stood a woman Eloan knew at once, though 3 years had thinned her lips and sharpened her further, and the sight of her landed like a stone in the stomach. Aunt Drusilla Vane. She had been guardian to both sisters since their parents drowned, for the Ashbys too. The sea took what it wanted, and she had the same face she had always had, handsome, cold, composed, with eyes the pale, flat gray of a knife held to the light. She wore expensive mourning. She had no cause to wear. She had always liked the authority of Black Eloan. The name in her aunt's mouth was not a greeting. It was an inventory. Her gaze moved down the plain traveling gown, the worn gloves, the boots gray with road dust, and something in her seemed to relax, satisfied by what poverty had made of her difficult niece. "You came, then?" Delphine asked me to. "Well," a thin smile. "You are here now. You will want to make yourself useful and not." Her eyes dropped to the child clinging to Eloan's hand, and her whole face changed, tightening with something sharper than displeasure. "What is that child doing?" "She took my hand, Aunt." I could hardly refuse her. "That child does not take hands." Drusilla's voice had gone very quiet, and quiet in her had always been the dangerous register. "Jenna, take Lady Wren upstairs. At once, the Duke does not wish her paraded. Do you understand me?" The nurse moved to obey, murmuring, coaxing, and the child's hand was drawn from Eluan's finger by finger. And as she was led away up the great stair, the little girl turned, twisted round against the nurse's grip, and looked back down at Eloan with those enormous eyes, and her small mouth opened as though there were a word in it after all. But no word came. And Eloan stood at the bottom of the stairs, with her hand still curled around the shape of a hand that was no longer there, and felt something crack quietly open in her chest that she had spent 3 years learning to keep shut. "Ellie!" The cry rang across the hall, bright as a bell, and then Delphine was flying down the stairs in a cloud of pale muslin, all gold hair and glad tears, and flung herself into her sister's arms. "Oh, you came! You truly came! I was so afraid you wouldn't." Delphine drew back to look at her, laughing, wet-eyed, radiant in the particular way of a girl who believes herself entirely happy. "You're thin. You're so thin and so grave. What have they done to you in Bath?" "Oh, never mind. You're here. Come. You must meet him. You must. He's the kindest man. Ellie, truly. Once you know him, he's only a little solemn, but underneath, Eloan let herself be pulled. There was nothing else to be done. To plant her feet, to refuse would be to invite the very questions she had come all this way to avoid. She fixed a small, pleasant, nothing of a smile onto her face. The companion's smile, the smile she had perfected across 3 years of pouring tea for a querulous old woman in Bath, and told herself that a man's back was only a man's back, that he might be anyone, that she did not yet have to feel anything at all. But her heart had begun to beat very hard and very high in her throat, the way it does when the body knows a thing before the mind will let it. And Delphine caught Eloan's hand, the same hand the child had held, and pulled her laughing across the great hall toward the tall windows where a man stood with his back to the room, tall and dark and utterly still, looking out at the gray heave of the sea as though he had been looking at it for 100 years. "Alaric," Delphine called gaily, "Alaric, come and meet my sister." The man turned. For one endless heartbeat, the whole grand, cold room seemed to hold its breath, and Eloan Ashby looked across 3 years and a dead engagement into the face of the man who had let her go, and watched the color drain from it as he recognized her too. To understand why 2 grown people should stand frozen in a sunlit hall while a bride-to-be beamed happily between them, you must go back 3 years to a gentler time and a different shore. Eloan Ashby had not always been a paid companion in a stranger's house. She had been a gentleman's daughter once, not rich, but respectable, the elder child of a Cornish naval captain and his gentle wife, raised in a snug rectory turn cottage above the same coast she now looked out on. Her father, Captain Ashby, had been a friend of the old Duke of Marrow, and so it had come about, in the natural, unhurried way of such things, that the captain's clever, grave elder daughter and the old duke's clever, grave younger son had known each other since they were children scrambling on the rocks after crabs. Alaric had not been meant to be duke. Then he had an elder brother, and so he had the rare freedom of a second son. He read what he liked, went where he liked, and fell in love where he liked. And he had fallen in love, slowly and completely and without any doubt at all, with Eloan Ashby. They were to be married. It had been understood between the families, half promised over 3 summers, and made real at last on a bright spring evening on the cliff path when Alaric had pressed a fistful of forget-me-nots into her hand, crushed and warm from his pocket, ridiculous, perfect, and asked her in a voice that shook, to be his wife. She had said yes before he had finished the question, and then the sea took everything. First, it took her parents in a spring squall that turned a pleasure sail into a tragedy and left the 2 Ashby sisters orphaned and penniless, wards of their father's cousin, Drusilla Vane. Then, within the same cruel year, a fever took Alaric's elder brother, and Alaric, who had never wanted it, who had wanted only his books and his shore and his Eloan, became the Duke of Marrow with all the weight of a great name pressing down on his shoulders. They had written to each other through it all. Letters had been the thread that held them across those months of grief and upheaval, his from the north, where the dukedom's business had called him, hers from her aunt's cold house, where she was learning what it was to be an orphan and a burden. And then the letters had stopped, not all at once. That was the cruelty of it. Eloan's letters to Alaric had begun to go unanswered. 1, then 2, then a silence that stretched into weeks. And into that silence had come, at last, a single note in his hand, brief and formal and unbearable, releasing her from the engagement. It would not be fair to bind you, it had said, to a life you did not choose, to a burden you did not seek. I release you and wish you every happiness. A. She had read it standing in her aunt's front hall, and something in her had gone quiet and gray, and stayed that way for 3 years. What Eloan did not know What she could not know, what no one in that sunlit hall knew but one, was that Alaric had received letters too, letters in her hand, or near enough her hand, growing colder by the week. A letter that told him her heart had changed, a letter that told him she could not love a man so weighed down with duty and grief that she wanted gaiety and freedom and a lighter life than a duke could give her. A final letter, releasing him and wishing him every happiness. Neither of those letters had been written by the hand that signed them. They had been written at a small writing desk in a cold house by a woman who had studied both their hands for years, who had intercepted the true letters at the post and burned them one by one, and who had understood with the flat, clear calculation that was her only genuine gift, that a duke who believed himself abandoned by a penniless orphan might, in time, be steered toward a more advantageous and more manageable bride, a younger sister perhaps, sweet-tempered, biddable, easily led, one who would never think to question where the Ashby girl's small inheritance had quietly gone. Drusilla Vane had not merely let the sea take Alowan's happiness. She had done the drowning herself, and so the two people at the center of it all stood frozen in the great hall of Marrow Court, each believing the other had walked away, each having spent 3 years nursing the private wound of being unwanted, while between them their happy, oblivious Delphine looked from one still face to the other, her smile just beginning to falter. "Alaric," she said uncertainly. "Ellie, have you two met before?" For a long moment no one answered her. Then Alaric Trevanion, Duke of Marrow, bowed. A stiff, formal, terrible bow, the bow of a man drowning and pretending he can swim, and said, in a voice with nothing left in it at all, "Miss Ashby and I were acquainted once, a long time ago, and Elowen, who had promised herself he would never see that it cost her anything, curtsied to the man she had been going to marry, and heard herself answer, 'A very long time ago, Your Grace.' But that night, alone in a cold guest room at the top of the East Wing, when she opened her small traveling trunk to find her nightgown, her fingers found something else first, something at the very bottom, wrapped in a handkerchief she had not unwrapped in 3 years. A letter, folded, sealed, addressed in her own hand, and never sent. The last letter she had written to Alaric on the night before his note of release had arrived. The letter that said she would wait for him through any grief, any duty, any weight the world could pile upon him, for as long as it took, for the whole of her life if need be. The letter she had carried to the post that terrible morning, and then, seeing his cold farewell already waiting for her, had brought home again, unsent, too proud, and too broken to send her whole heart to a man who no longer wanted it. She sat on the edge of the strange bed, with the sea booming against the rocks below, and she held the letter in her 2 hands, and she understood, with a slow, cold horror, only half of a truth she could not yet see the whole of. If I still have my last letter, then he never read the words I truly meant. So what then were the words he read? The days before a great wedding are their own kind of weather. Marrow Court filled with it, with florists and dressmakers, with hampers from the village, and crates of hothouse fruit, with the constant low industry of a house preparing to be looked at. And in the middle of all of it, Lowen Ashby learned very quickly what her place was to be. It was to be nowhere. Her aunt saw to that with the quiet efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime arranging things to her liking. There was no cruelty in it that anyone could have pointed to. It was only that Elowen was always, somehow, in the wrong room. When the sisters might have sat together over the wedding linens, Elowen was sent to count candles in the still room. When Delphine was fitted for her gown, Elowen was given a basket of the aunt's mending. She took her meals at the end of the long table below the visiting cousins, and Drusilla addressed her only to give instruction, and the household, reading the wind the way households do, arranged its manners accordingly. Elowen bore it as she bore everything now with a stillness that gave nothing away. She had learned in Bath that the surest way to rob a small cruelty of its power was to refuse to be seen to feel it. She counted the candles. She mended the seams. She did not complain, and in the counting and the mending she made herself small and quiet and useful. And she moved through the great house like a shadow that had learned to apologize for falling. But she watched. She could not help but watch her aunt, this woman who had raised her without warmth and married off her parents' memory without grief, moving through the great house as though she owned it, and she began, slowly, to feel the shape of a question she could not yet put into words. It was Delphine who gave her the first hour of real happiness. The younger girl slipped into Eloin's cold little room on the second night in her nightgown with a candle, exactly as she had when they were small, and climbed onto the bed and talked until the tallow guttered, about the wedding, about her gown, about how frightened she was and how happy, all in the same breathless tumble. "He is good to me, Ellie," she said at the last, growing quiet. "I want you to know it. He does not love me. I am not such a fool as to think it. But he is kind, and he means to be a good husband, and there is the little one to think of. Poor mite, Aunt says a girl in my position cannot hope for love as well as a title. She says love is a luxury for the rich." Delphine's bright face clouded. "Do you think that's true?" Eloin looked at her sister, golden, trusting. About to marry the one man on earth, Eloin could not watch her marry, and felt the whole weight of the secret pressed down on her chest. "No," she said softly. "I don't think that's true at all." She did not sleep that night, and it was in the small, cold hours going down the servants' stair for a cup of water because she could not bear the ceiling any longer that she heard the voices. The still room door stood ajar, and a lamp burned inside, and her aunt's voice came through the gap. Low, precise, unhurried. The morning after, and not an hour later. "I've told her already, but I want it seen to. Order the trap for 6. She is to be gone before the house wakes." A pause. The clink of a bottle. She was a mistake to invite, whatever the girl wanted. The elder one has always had a way of unsettling things simply by standing in a room. Once Delphine is safely wed, she may go back to Bath and rot there, and good riddance. Another voice murmured something Eloin could not catch the housekeeper. "Perhaps." "No," Drusilla said. "She is to have no time alone with the Duke. None. Do you understand me? Not a moment. If he should ask for her, you will find a reason. That is all." Eloin stood frozen on the dark stair, her bare feet cold on the stone, her heart going hard. "She means to have me gone before the vows, and she is afraid, genuinely afraid, of my speaking with him alone." She crept back up to her room and did not light a candle. She sat on the edge of the bed in the dark and took out the 2 folded papers she now kept together, her own unsent letter, and beneath it, the farewell note in Alaric's hand that had ended her life 3 years ago, the note she had never been able to throw away. She unfolded the farewell note in the gray dawn light and read it again for the first time in years. "It would not be fair to bind you." She had read those words 1,000 times as a girl and drowned in them. But now, older, colder, taught by 3 years of copying an old woman's correspondence how a hand can be learned and mimicked, now she looked not at the words but at the paper itself, at the pale cream-laid sheet, at the faint watermark held up to the strengthening light, and her blood went slowly cold, because she knew that paper. She had seen a whole ream of it, her whole childhood, in the locked drawer of a certain writing desk. The faint crown and anchor watermark, the particular weight of it under the thumb. She had been made to write her copybook lines on the cheaper stuff, while that fine cream-laid paper sat locked away, too dear for a charity child's scrawl. Her aunt's desk, her aunt's paper, and a farewell note supposedly written by a heartbroken duke 100 miles to the north set down upon it. Eloin sat very still in the growing light while the whole shape of 3 lost years began, at last, to turn slowly over in the dark and show her its other, hidden face. Alaric Trevanion had not wanted to marry again. He said this to himself often, in the long nights, as though repeating it might make the coming wedding feel less like a slow walk into cold water. He had loved once, entirely, and the loving had been taken from him, first by silence, then by a letter, and he had folded that part of himself away and given the rest to duty, because duty at least did not leave. There was the dukedom. There were the tenants and the tin mine and the endless grinding accounts. And there was Wren. His daughter was the great unhealed wound of his life. Ginevra, the wife, his family had found for him in the gray, years after Alowan, a gentle, sickly, kindly woman he had respected without ever quite reaching, had given him the child, and then slipped away from a fever, and Wren had followed her mother into a silence no one could reach. 2 years, and not a word. 2 years of doctors and their useless verdicts, of the child growing quieter and stranger and further away, until Alaric had come to believe he had failed at the one thing that mattered, that he was a man who could not even hold his own child in the world. The marriage to Delphine Ashby was his mother's idea and Drusilla Vane's arranging, and his own weary surrender. The girl was sweet and young and would, everyone assured him, be a soft, warm presence in a cold house, and the child needed a mother, and a duke owed his name and heir, and love, he had long since decided, was a country he was no longer permitted to enter. Delphine deserved better than a husband who could not love her. But he would be kind. He had promised himself that much. He would be kind, and it would be enough, because it had to be. And then his mother's carriage had brought the bride's family down from Bath, and he had turned from the window of his own great hall and looked into a face out of a life he had buried, and the cold water had closed over his head entirely. Alowan. She was thin, that had been his first thought, a stab of it, absurd and painful, thin and gray and worn, in a gown 3 seasons old, with the composed, unreadable face of a woman who had learned to expect nothing. This was not the woman of the letters. The letters had told him of a girl hungry for gaiety, for balls and freedom and a lighter life than his grief could give her. He had pictured her, these 3 years, laughing somewhere in bright rooms, glad to be free of him. The woman in his hall did not look as though she had laughed in a very long time. It confused him. It sat wrong, like a sum that would not come out however he worked it. And Alaric Trevanion, whose only refuge from feeling had always been the cold, clean machinery of his own reason, found he could not stop working at it. He watched her, over those days, more than he should have. He saw how her aunt kept her small and busy and apart, and how she bore it without protest, and there was no bitterness in her bearing, only a kind of terrible practiced patience. He saw her with the servants, gentle, exact, thanking them for small things as though she knew what it was to go unthanked. He saw her pause on the terrace one gray evening, alone, and look out at the sea with an expression of such quiet, private grief that he had to turn away from the window ashamed, as though he had opened a letter meant for someone else. None of it matched the woman he had spent 3 years despising in order to survive. But it was Wren who undid him. He came upon them in the long gallery on the 4th morning, his silent daughter and the woman he had lost, and stopped in the doorway, unseen. Wren was sitting on the floor, in a bar of pale sun, and Alowan was sitting on the boards beside her, not talking, not coaxing, not managing, simply sitting, turning the pages of a picture book so the child could look. And as he watched, Wren leaned, slowly by degrees the way a wild thing tests a hand, until her small dark head came to rest against Alowan's arm, his daughter who flinched from her own grandmother, who had not willingly touched a living soul in 2 years. Alaric stood in the doorway with his hand against the cold frame and felt something crack open in his chest with a pain so sharp it stole his breath, grief and hope and a wild, unreasoning tenderness all at once, all the feeling he had spent 2 years and 3 not feeling, breaking loose in a single instant at the sight of his child's head against Alowan Ashby's arm. He stepped back before they saw him. He walked the length of the house and out onto the terrace, and stood in the wind until he could breathe. The gulls wheeled and cried above the cove. Below him the tide was coming in, patient and enormous, filling every hollow in the rocks it had emptied hours before, and he watched it and thought, without wanting to, that some things the sea takes it also, in time gives back. The letters were wrong, said a small, cold, clear voice in him, the voice of reason he had trusted his whole life. Everything the letters told you about her was wrong, so either she is the finest liar in England, or those letters lied. He did not know which he believed, but he knew, standing there with the sea roaring below him and his daughter's silence upstairs and his wedding 4 days off, that he could not marry anyone until he had stood in a room alone with Eloan Ashby and asked her to her face the question that had rotted in him for 3 years. Why did you stop loving me? He would find her alone. Tonight, if he could, he would have his answer. He did not know that somewhere in the same house, a woman with a pale, flat gaze had already given orders that he never should. The summons came the next afternoon, and it came from the one person at Merrow Court whom Drusilla Vane could not order about. "Her Grace, the Dowager Duchess," said the footman, with the particular reverence the old lady still commanded, "requests Miss Ashby attend her in the blue sitting-room." Eloan went and found the Dowager Duchess Rosamond by the window, with a great tortoiseshell cat asleep in her lap, and a shrewd, bright eye that missed nothing. She was very old and very upright, dressed in soft dove gray, and she watched Eloan cross the room with the frank appraising interest of a woman long past the age of pretending. "So," she said, "you came back, Your Grace." Eloan curtsied. "Sit down, child, I can't crane my neck there." The old lady studied her for a long moment. "You don't remember me?" "No." "You were a slip of a thing. All elbows, forever on the rocks after crabs with my Alaric. But I remember you, Eloan Ashby. I remember when my son could not say 3 sentences without your name." In one of them her voice was dry, but her eyes were not, and then it stopped, as though a door had shut. And no one would ever tell me why. Eloan said nothing. Her hands had gone tight in her lap. "I watched a good man turn to stone," the dowager went on, quietly now. "I watched him marry a woman he did not love, because he had decided love was finished with him. And I told myself it was grief, his brother, then poor Ginevra, then the child's silence. Grief enough for any man." She stroked the cat with one thin ringed hand. "But grief does not shut a door like that. A door like that is shut by someone from the outside." The old woman's gaze sharpened on her. "You did not stop loving my son," she said. "It was not a question. I have watched your face for 3 days. I watched it when he walked into that hall. Whatever ended it, child, it was not your doing, and I do not think it was his. Something in Eloan, some wall she had held up so long she had forgotten it was a thing she was choosing to hold, trembled at the first true kindness she had been shown since her father died. Her eyes stung. She looked down at her hands. "I cannot speak of it, Your Grace," she managed. "It would only make trouble." "My sister's happiness, your sister," the dowager said crisply, "is marrying a man who does not love her, arranged by a woman I would not trust to mind a hen coop. I would not lose too much sleep over disturbing that peace." She leaned forward, and the cat woke and dropped from her lap with a thump. "Listen to me. I am old, and I have watched a great many people lie in this house, and I know the smell of it. There is a lie sitting at the center of my son's life, and it has cost him 3 years, and very nearly cost him his soul, and I mean to see it out into the light before it costs him the rest." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost its edge and gone somewhere older and sadder. "People speak a great deal of forgiveness, child, and of letting the past lie. I have buried a husband and a son and a daughter-in-law, and I will tell you what I have learned. There is a difference between the peace that comes from healing and the peace that comes from silence, from everyone agreeing not to look at the thing in the corner of the room. The first is a mercy, the second is a slow rot. This house has chosen the second for 3 years, and it is dying of it, quietly, from the inside. My son, That poor, voiceless child. All of us, tiptoeing round a grief we will not name. She fixed Elowen with her bright old eye. I am too near my grave to go on tiptoeing. I would rather have the truth, however it cuts, than one more year of this genteel drowning. Elowen's throat had closed. She could not have spoken if she had wished to. Now, you loved him. He loved you. Letters passed between you and then, all at once, they carried poison instead of love, and each of you was told the other had turned away. She watched Elowen's face go white. Yes, I thought as much. It was letters. It is always letters. And now I will ask you one question, child, and I want you to think very hard before you answer it, because I believe your whole life may turn upon it. She fixed Elowen with that bright, pitiless old eye. In all those years, the dowager said slowly, who collected the post at your aunt's house, whose hands did every letter coming and going pass through before it ever reached you? The room went very quiet. Somewhere far below, the tide worked patiently at the foot of the cliffs, and Elowen Ashby heard herself whisper, in a voice she did not recognize, the answer that broke the last floorboard beneath her feet. My aunts. The dowager sat back slowly, and something in her old face settled, grim and satisfied and terribly sad all at once. Then we understand each other, she said. She reached across and, to Elowen's astonishment, took her cold hand in both of her warm, dry ones and held it fast. Hear me now, Elowen Ashby, for I do not say such things twice. You came into this house believing you had no friend in it. You were wrong. I am one. And I believe when he learns the truth of it, my son will be another. Her grip tightened. You have been made small and quiet and grateful for scraps for 3 long years. That is done. From this hour, you are not alone in it. Do you understand me? The kindness was more than Elowen could bear. The tears she had refused to shed since her father died spilled over at last, silent and hot, and the old woman let her weep and did not once let go of her hand. When it had passed, the dowager pressed a handkerchief on her and spoke once more, low and certain. Say nothing to your aunt, nothing. Let her believe she has won, and she will grow careless. But you must find the proof, child, the letters themselves, if she has been fool enough to keep them, or anything that shows the hand for what it is, and you must find it before Saturday. Her eyes glinted. Because on Saturday my son means to marry your sister at that altar, and once the words are said, no truth on earth will easily unsay them. Ask your aunt about the letters, Elowen. Watch her face when you do, and then find where she keeps her secrets, before the bells ring, 2 days. That was all that stood between Delphine Ashby and the altar, and between Elowen and the truth she now knew she had to drag into the light before the bells rang. She moved through those 2 days with a new and secret purpose burning under her stillness. Outwardly she was the same shadow, counting, mending, thanking the maids, but her eyes were open now in a way they had not been for 3 years, and everything she saw arranged itself around a single question. Where does she keep them? For she was certain now that the letters existed. She had tested it. She had waited until she and her aunt were alone in the still room, and then, keeping her voice light as she polished a row of silver, she had said, Do you know, Aunt, I was thinking only this morning of the letters I used to write when I was a girl. Long ones. I wonder whatever became of them. The reaction had been small and to anyone not watching for it, invisible. Drusilla Vane's hands had gone still on the account book before her. Just for a moment. Then they had moved again, smooth as ever. Girlish nonsense, her aunt had said, not looking up. Burned long ago, I should think. One does not keep such things. A pause, and then, in a different voice, quiet and flat and cold, You would do well to leave the past where it lies, Elowen. Digging in old ground turns up nothing but worms. Go and see to the linens. But Elowen had seen the stillness. And she had heard, under the flatness, the unmistakable low note of fear. She is afraid, and people do not fear what they have burned. There was a moment, too, that stayed with her. Passing the nursery that afternoon, she had found the door ajar and Wren inside, alone, arranging and rearranging a row of pebbles on the windowsill with the fierce, wordless concentration that was the only language the child had left. Aloan had gone in and sat with her a while, saying nothing, and the little girl had leaned into her side and put one small pebble very deliberately into Aloan's palm and closed her fingers over it. A gift, or a question, or a plea. Aloan could not have said which, but she had understood one thing with sudden painful clarity, that whatever she did in the next 2 days, she was no longer doing it only for herself, or only for a love 3 years buried. There was this silent child now, who had chosen her and whom her aunt's schemes had already half-orphaned twice over. She put the pebble in her pocket and kept it there. There was, too, a strange gentleness waiting for her in the most unlikely quarter. Her aunt's own maid, Morwenna, a gaunt, gray, silent woman who had served Drusilla Vane for 20 years and been ground down to a shadow by it, stopped Aloan in a passage that evening, glanced both ways, and pressed a small hot pasty into her hands, wrapped in a cloth. "You're not eating, miss," Morwenna muttered, not meeting her eyes. "I knew your mother. She was good to me, when there was no one else. You've her look about you." And then, in a rush, so low Aloan barely caught it. "This is not a kind house, miss. It never was. If you ever have need of someone who remembers how things were—" She stopped, frightened at herself, and hurried away before Aloan could answer. Aloan stood holding the warm pasty and thought, there is someone who knows. She saw Alaric only twice in those 2 days, and both times the sight of him went through her like a blade. The second time he found her alone. She was in the little walled garden at dusk, cutting the last roses for the chapel as she had been bidden, and he came through the gate and stopped. And for a moment they simply looked at each other across the darkening beds, 3 years and a whole ruined life standing in the air between them. "Aloan," he said. Just that, her name in his voice, which she had not heard for 3 years, and which she had told herself she had forgotten. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice did not shake, which she counted a victory. He took a step toward her. "I must speak with you. Not like this, alone. There is a thing I have carried 3 years that I can no longer. His Grace is wanted, in the library. Mrs. Traywin, the housekeeper, had appeared in the gateway as if conjured, her face a careful blank. "Mrs. Vane is most particular, your Grace, the settlements. The lawyer is waiting." Aloan saw the flare of frustration in his face, quickly mastered. He was a duke. A duke did not brawl with his own housekeeper in a rose garden. But before he turned, he did a small thing that undid her. He looked at the roses in her hands, and then at her face, and he said very low, so that only she could hear it beneath the wind, "You used to wear them in your hair. On the cliff path. I have never once forgotten it." And then he bowed stiffly and was gone, leaving her standing among the darkening beds, with her heart pounding and a rose crushed unregarded in her fist. And Aloan understood, watching the empty gate, exactly what her aunt's orders had bought. A wall of servants and errands and lawyers, raised specifically to keep 2 people from ever standing alone in a room. Drusilla was not merely cruel. She was careful. And careful people keep their evidence close. She thought of the note on her aunt's own paper. She thought of the ledger she was sure must exist. She thought of a whole hidden life of theft and forgery, and how a woman like Drusilla Vane, who trusted no one, would never entrust such things to another's keeping or another's hearth. No, she would keep them where she could put her hand on them in the dark. She would keep them close. That night, lying awake while the wind rose off the sea and the first far growl of a storm rolled in over the water, Aloan made her decision. Her aunt never let a certain object out of her sight. A flat rosewood dispatch box, brass-bound, that traveled with her everywhere and lived, locked, on the writing table in her private sitting room. Aloan had watched her lock things into it and unlock it with a small key she wore on a chain at her waist, even to dinner, Whatever Drusilla Vane most feared to lose was in that box. The storm would cover any noise. The house would be sleeping, and there was only one night left before the last night, and the last night would be too late tonight. Then Eloan lay in the dark and listened to her own heart and the coming storm. Tonight I open the box, or I lose him a second time forever. The storm came in off the Atlantic a little after midnight, and Marrow Court groaned under it like a ship. Rain drove against the windows in long hissing sheets. The wind found every gap in the old granite and moaned through the passages, and somewhere below, the sea flung itself against the rocks of the cove, with a sound like the world ending. Eloan went in her stockinged feet, a single unlit candle in her hand, down the black length of the east wing toward her aunt's sitting room. Her heart beat so hard she thought the house must hear it over the storm. Twice she froze at a sound, and found it was only the wind. Once lightning lit the whole passage white, and she saw her own reflection in a black window, a pale ghost of a woman, and nearly cried out. The sitting room door was unlocked. Of course it was. Who would dare? She slipped inside and pushed it to behind her, and stood breathing in the dark, and then with hands that would not quite steady, she struck a light. The rosewood box sat on the writing table, brass gleaming faintly in the candle flame. It was locked, and she had no key. But she had come prepared with the thing her 3 gray years as a companion had taught her: patience, and a hairpin, and the memory of an old locksmith in Bath who had shown a bored young woman once how a simple ward lock gives if you are gentle and do not hurry it. She knelt, she worked. The storm howled. Her hands shook and steadied and shook again. The lock gave with a small click that seemed to her louder than the thunder. She lifted the lid, and there, beneath a false leather tray that came away in her fingers, she found them. Not love letters. Better and worse. A ledger, thin, close written, in her aunt's own precise hand, and Eloan had only to read a single page by the leaping candle flame to understand it. Sums, dates. The rents of a small Devon property that was hers by right, drawn quarter by quarter into Drusilla Vane's own accounts. The sale of her mother's jewels. The steady, patient, years-long theft of everything 2 orphaned girls had been left, hidden behind a guardian's tender care. Motive, said the cold, clear part of her mind, even as her hands trembled with rage. This is why. Not only to steer a duke to the biddable sister, but because a married, settled, incurious Delphine would never think to ask where the money went, and a heartbroken Eloan, exiled to Bath, could not. And beneath the ledger, tied in a faded blue ribbon, I rather thought, said a voice from the doorway, that you would come. Eloan turned. Alaric stood in the doorway, a candle in his own hand, rain still bright in his dark hair. He had not been able to sleep either. He had come, she would learn, to lie in wait for the chance to speak with her that the house had denied him, and had seen her light moving down the passage, and had followed. For a moment neither moved. Then his eyes went past her to the open box, the ledger, the ribboned bundle, and his face changed. "What is this?" he said, not a question. And Eloan Ashby, who had held her tongue for 3 long years, held it no longer. She crossed the room and thrust the faded bundle into his hands. "I don't know," she said, her voice shaking now with everything she had swallowed. "But I know what you did, Your Grace. I know you wrote to me that it would not be fair to bind me, that you released me, that you wished me every happiness." Her voice cracked on the word. "I waited. Do you understand me? I waited through my parents' graves, and your brothers, and I would have waited through anything, and you sent me a note, 3 lines, and let me go as though I were a servant you had no more use for. I let you go." He had gone white. "You wrote to me, letter after letter, colder each time, that you wanted gaiety, that you could not love a man so weighed down, that my grief was a burden to you, and you wished to be free of it." His hands were shaking on the blue ribbon. "I have your letters, Eloan. I kept them. Heaven help me, I read them until they came apart, trying to understand how the girl on the cliff path could have written them. I told myself I had never truly known you. I built 3 years on the belief that I had never truly known you, and I built mine believing you had grown tired of a penniless orphan the moment your dukedom made you too grand for her. Her breath came ragged. Do you know what your note did to me? I stood in my aunt's hall and read 3 lines and felt my whole life close over like water. I never blamed you. That was the cruelest part, I thought. Of course. Of course a duke cannot marry the drowned captain's daughter. I thought you were being kind. I would sooner have cut off my hand than send you those words. I never wrote mine. They stared at each other across the little candlelit room while the storm screamed against the glass. For a long moment, neither of them breathed. And then, slowly, the same impossible thought rose in both their faces at once. The thought of 2 people who have each spent years believing themselves unloved and who realize, in a single lurching instant, that the story they had built their grief upon was never true. I never wrote those words, Elowen whispered. Nor I mine, he said. And in the silence that followed, both of them turned slowly to look at the faded blue ribbon in his hands. He pulled it loose. The paper spread. And there, in the leaping light, they saw it together, draft after draft in a careful laboring hand, a hand practicing to be 2 other hands, Elowen's loops, worked over and over until they came near enough, his own square strokes copied and copied. Cold sentences composed and crossed out and bettered. Your grief is a burden I did not seek, written and struck through and rewritten harder. A whole patient forgery of 2 hearts, kept as such creatures keep everything, as leverage, as insurance, as a thing too useful ever quite to burn. Elowen picked up one of the practice sheets with a hand gone numb. Her own name, written 30 times down a page in her aunt's cramped hand, each E a little truer than the last. Like a child learning to write, except it was not a child. It was a grown woman patiently teaching herself to counterfeit a girl's love so that she might snuff it out. The wickedness of it was so cold, so domestic, that Elowen felt sick. She wrote them, Alaric said, and his voice was terrible. She wrote them both. She has been standing between us the whole of 3 years. The truth of it broke over them like the sea over the rocks below. 3 years. A dead marriage arranged, a living one about to be. All of it built on a lie a jealous, grasping woman had penned at a writing desk. Elowen felt the room tilt, felt, absurdly, like laughing and weeping at once. Felt Alaric's hand close hard around hers as though to keep them both from falling. Elowen! He said low, and there was 3 years of grief in it, and something else, waking underneath. Elowen, I never stopped. The door crashed open. It was not Drusilla. It was Jenna, the nurse, wild-eyed, her nightcap askew and her candle guttering, and she was already sobbing before she had the words out. Your Grace. Oh, Your Grace, forgive me. Lady Wren, she's not in her bed. The window's open. The little garden door standing wide to the storm. I've looked everywhere. We've all looked. She's gone. Your Grace, she's gone out into the night. For one frozen instant, the 3 of them stood in the ruined secret of the little room, while the storm shrieked and the sea roared for its own. The proof was in their hands. And the child was gone into the dark. The house came awake all at once, the way houses do at the word child, and the word lost in the same breath. Lamps flared. Boots pounded. Grooms were sent to the stables and footmen to the cliff path, and Mrs. Stables, Trewin stood in the hall calling names, and out of her own room in her wrapper came Drusilla Vane, her gray plaid down her back, demanding to know the meaning of the uproar, and going very still indeed when she saw the rosewood box in Elowen's arms and the blue ribbon in the Duke's hand. But no one had time for her now, not even her. The cove, Elowen said. Alaric turned. What? She won't have gone to the cliff path. They'll not find her there. Elowen was already pulling a cloak from a peg, her mind moving fast and sure. Think, where does a grieving child go? not toward the danger she's been warned from, toward the person she has lost, or the nearest thing to her. She met his eyes. "Where's Ginevra buried?" Something moved in his face. "The old chapel yard above the cove. There is a—" She used to take Wren to the little blue flowers that grow along the wall. The forget-me-nots. They went together out into the screaming dark, lantern-swinging, rain-like thrown gravel. The path to the old chapel yard ran along the cliff edge above the cove, and the sea below was a white fury in the lantern light. Anna Lowen's heart was a fist in her throat the whole way. The wind tried to tear the light from her hand and the breath from her lungs. Twice she slipped in the streaming mud, and Alaric's grip on her arm was all that kept her from the edge. Neither of them spoke. There was no room in either of them for anything but the same drumbeat prayer. Let her be there. Let her be there, and let her be safe, and I will ask nothing more of heaven, so long as I live. They came over the rise to the old chapel yard, where the leaning headstone stood black against the storm, and the low wall ran along the very lip of the cliff. She was there. A small white shape, drenched to the bone, huddled against the low chapel wall among the battered blue flowers, her arms wrapped around her knees, her dark hair plastered to her face. Lady Wren, 6 years old, who had gone out alone into a storm to sit by her mother. Alowen reached her first. She fell to her knees in the mud and the flowers and gathered the shaking child into her arms, and Wren clung to her with a strength that was almost violent, her small, cold face buried in Alowen's neck. "I have you," Alowen said over and over, rocking her in the rain. "I have you, little one. I have you. You're safe. I have you." And she understood, holding that desperate grip, what had sent the child into the storm. Wren had heard it. Some scrap of the household's talk, some careless word that the lady who sat on the floor and turned the pages and asked nothing of her was to be sent away the morning after the wedding, packed off before the house woke, gone. And the child who had lost her mother to silence had run out into the dark rather than lose the one person who had reached her through it. She had come to the only place she connected with the word lost, her mother's grave, and the little blue flowers her mother had loved, as if to keep her two vanishing people company in one place at once. The thought split something open in Alowen. She held the child tighter and pressed her lips to the wet, dark hair. No, she thought fiercely. No more losing. Not her. Not him. Not one thing more. So long as I live. Alaric knelt in the mud beside them and wrapped his arms around them both, his daughter and the woman he had lost and found in a single night, and for a moment the three of them stayed there in the ruined chapel yard while the storm spent itself around them. He did not speak, but over the child's head his eyes found Alowen's, and what was in them needed no letter, forged or true, to be understood. They carried her home between them. They dried her and warmed her, and sat with her while she slept at last, and it was in the quiet gray hour before dawn, as the storm blew itself out, that Morwenna came to Alowen at the nursery door. The gaunt gray maid had a bundle under her shawl. Her hands trembled as she held it out. I couldn't do it, miss," she whispered. 3 years ago. She gave me your true letters, the real ones, the ones you wrote him and he wrote you, and bid me burn them, and I burned some. God forgive me. I was afraid of her, but not all. I kept these back. Her worn face crumpled. I don't know why. Because your mother was kind to me, maybe. Because it was wicked, and I knew it. I've carried them 3 years and been sick with it. She pressed the packet into Alowen's hands. Your own hand, miss, and his, the true ones. If it should ever come to anyone needing proof of what she did, I'll stand up and say it. I'll say all of it. I'm done being afraid of her. Alowen held the packet, her own true words and his, saved from the fire by a frightened woman's last shred of conscience, and could not speak. She looked up, and through the nursery window she saw the sky going pale in the east, the storm rack tearing apart to show a thin, cold, clean light. Dawn. and with a lurch of the heart she remembered what dawn meant. Below, faintly she heard it, the household stirring, moving, faster than any ordinary morning. A carriage on the gravel, the chapel bell beginning, high and urgent to ring. Drusilla had not fled. Drusilla had done the only thing left to a cornered creature with one card unplayed. She had gone to Delphine's room in the dark and roused her, and pressed a wedding forward. The storm, my love, the roads. We dare not wait, better done, quickly and quietly. Come, come now. And even now was hurrying and bewildered half-dressed bride toward the chapel to say the vows before the truth could reach the altar. The bells were ringing, the wedding was beginning, and it was starting now. Eloan ran. She ran with the packet of letters clutched to her breast, and Morwenna stumbling behind her, and her heart hammering down the great stair, and through the hall, and out across the wet gravel toward the chapel, where the bell was ringing and the door stood open, and within, a vicar's voice had already begun the words that would bind her sister to the man she herself had never stopped loving. She burst through the chapel doors. The scene stopped her on the threshold like a wall. The little chapel, gray-lit through storm-washed windows. Delphine at the altar in a hastily pinned gown, pale and confused. The vicar, prayer book open. The dowager duchess in the front pew, upright and watchful, having refused every attempt to keep her away. Drusilla Vane at the aisle's head, gray-faced, rigid, wheeling the words on by force of her flat, cold stare. And there, waiting at the altar, tall and dark and still, exactly where the whole of it had been driving from the first, the Duke who had once let her go. Except he was not looking at his bride. He had turned at the crash of the doors, and he was looking down the aisle at Eloan. And on his face was not the resignation of a man being married, but the blazing, unmistakable resolve of a man who has been waiting for exactly this. He had let Drusilla Vane hurry them all to this altar for one reason only. A lie so vast deserved to die in the open before every witness she had herself assembled to seal it. If any man can show just cause, the vicar was saying, why these two may not lawfully be joined together, let him now speak, or else hereafter forever hold his. I can. Two voices, Eloan's from the doors, and Alaric's from the altar. They spoke the words together. The chapel erupted in a rustle of shock. Delphine's hand flew to her mouth, and Drusilla Vane rounded on the room with the snarl of a trapped animal. This woman is jealous and deranged, she cried. She has always coveted her sister's good fortune. Seize her, someone, remove her. No one, said the Dowager Duchess, rising slowly to her feet, her voice ringing to the rafters, will remove anyone. Let the girl speak. And Eloan walked up the aisle of that chapel, no longer the gray shadow who apologized for falling, but Eloan Ashby, upright, drenched, terrible, with 3 years of held truth. And she laid the letters on the altar rail, and she told them, all of it, the betrothal on the cliff path, and the fistful of forget-me-nots, the letters that had passed between two loving hearts, and the poison that had crept into them week by week, until each believed the other had turned cold. The 3 lines that had ended her life, written on paper she had known since childhood, her aunt's own paper, the years of gray exile in Bath. And then, her voice never rising, never breaking, she told them of the rosewood box and what it held, the ledgers, the stolen rents, the sold jewels, the whole patient architecture of a guardian's greed, built on the ruin of the 2 girls she had been trusted to protect. She did not do it for spite alone, Eloan said, into the ringing hush. She did it for money. A married sister, safely settled to a duke, would never think to ask where her inheritance had gone. And a heartbroken sister sent away to be a stranger's companion could not. Every lie she told served the same master. She sold my happiness and my sister's to cover a theft. And Morwenna, weeping, stepped forward and swore before God and the vicar that every word was true, that she had seen the forgeries penned at the writing desk night after night, that she had been handed the true letters and ordered to burn them, and that she had not been able to make herself burn them all. Drusilla's face came apart piece by piece as she spoke. "Show me," said the Duke quietly. He took up the true letters and the forged drafts side by side and held them to the gray light, and the vicar looked, and the dowager looked, and even poor bewildered Delphine looked, and there was no mistaking it. The labored hand, the practiced loops the lie made visible. "You wrote these," Alaric said, turning at last to Drusilla Vane, and his voice was the sea against the rocks. "You stood between us for 3 years. You stole these girls' inheritance and their father's memory, and you would have stolen the rest of all our lives this morning rather than be found out." He set the papers down. "It is over." And in the ringing silence that followed, the silence of a whole room that does not know what will happen next, the silence of a duke and a housekeeper and a bride and an old woman and a weeping maid all suspended between one life and another, a small, clear voice spoke, "Don't go." The words fell into the hush like 2 pebbles into a still pool, and the whole chapel seemed to stop breathing. Every head turned. Wren stood in the side doorway, wrapped in the blanket they had swaddled her in after the storm, having slipped from her nurse to follow the noise, as she always followed noise now to find the one face she wanted. Her dark hair was still damp. Her enormous eyes were fixed unblinking on Eloan. And she had spoken. She, who had not made a sound in 2 years, whom the finest doctors in London had given up as lost, inside her own grief, she had spoken, in a voice rusty and small, and utterly, unmistakably certain. "Don't go," Lady Wren said again to the woman who had reached her through the dark, and her small face crumpled, and she held out both her arms. For one heartbeat no one moved. Alaric had gone rigid, his hand at his mouth, and a sound escaped him that no one in that house had ever heard a duke make. Half a sob, half a laugh, the sound of a father hearing his child's voice come back from the dead. Then Eloan was across the chapel and on her knees on the cold stone with her arms around the child, before she knew she had moved, weeping without shame. And Wren wound her arms around Eloan's neck and buried her face there, and said it once more, wonderingly. Tasting the words as though she had only just discovered she still owned them. "Don't go." And Eloan drew back and took the small, wet face in both her hands and said fierce and certain, "Never, do you hear me? Never. I will never go. I promise you with my whole heart, for the rest of my life, I will never, ever go." And Alaric came and knelt with them and gathered them both against him, his daughter and his Eloan, on the floor of the chapel where he had come so near to marrying the wrong sister, and the 3 of them held one another while the whole room wept around them. It was Delphine who broke the last of it open. She had stood at the altar through all of it forgotten, her wedding collapsing around her, and when Eloan at last looked up at her sister in dawning horror, ready to beg forgiveness, she found Delphine not weeping but smiling, a wobbling, brilliant, relieved smile, tears standing in her eyes. "Oh, Ellie," she said, "you goose. Did you think I wanted this?" She came down from the altar, stepping out of the whole arrangement as lightly as stepping out of a coat, her hastily pinned veil trailing forgotten behind her, and took her sister's wet face in her hands. "I never loved him. He never loved me. We both knew it, 2 polite strangers, doing our duty and calling it a wedding. Aunt kept telling me this was all a girl in my position could hope for, that love was for other luckier people, and I believed her because she had sent away the one person who would have told me otherwise." Her voice broke, then steadied. "She sent you away, Ellie, so that I would have no one left to tell me the truth." She looked at Alaric, at the child in Eloan's arms, at the damning letters spread upon the altar rail. An understanding filled her face like sunrise. "But it was never mine to have," Delphine said softly. "Any fool can see it now. It was always yours. From the cliff path, from the very first, it was always yours." And she gathered up her sister's cold hand, and the Duke's together, and pressed them one into the other, and stepped back, and gave them her whole glad blessing. and the wrong wedding ended, at the very lip of the altar, in the only right way it ever could have. What to do with Drusilla Vane was, in the end, Alohan's to decide, and everyone in that gray dawn chapel understood it. The law would have taken her. Forgery, embezzlement, the theft of a ward's inheritance, a magistrate would have been glad of it, and there was proof enough now to see her ruined, imprisoned, disgraced before the whole county. Alaric, white with a cold fury, was ready to send for the constable that very hour. Even Morwenna, who had feared her 20 years, would not have wept. Alohan stood in the chapel with the child's hand in hers, and looked at the woman who had stolen 3 years of her life, her fortune, and very nearly her whole future, and found to her own surprise that she did not want it. "No," she said quietly. "Alohan," Alaric turned to her. "After everything I know what she did." Alohan's voice was steady. "I have known it in my body every gray morning for 3 years. And I have learned this much from it, Alaric, that to give back cruelty for cruelty only makes the world a little colder, and I am so tired of the cold." She looked at Drusilla, shrunken now, exposed, an old woman whose whole life had been built on control, and who had just watched every last thread of it burn. "The Dowager told me something the day she took my side. She said there is a difference between fairness and justice. Fairness would be to do to my aunt exactly what she did to me, to see her cast out, penniless, disgraced, made small and sent away to rot. And I could have it. Everyone in this room would help me to it." She shook her head slowly. "But I don't want to become her in order to punish her. I don't want her destroyed. I want her gone. I want her small and quiet and powerless and far away, and I want never to think of her again." She looked down at Wren's hand in hers, and at the letters on the altar rail, and at the man she had crossed 3 years to reach. "She spent her whole life taking things from people," Alohan said softly. "I would rather spend mine keeping them." And so it was done, not with the constable, but with the Dowager Duchess's cold efficiency. The stolen inheritance would be restored to the last penny, the accounts opened and set right. Drusilla Vane would sign a full confession kept, unpublished, as surety, and then she would be taken to a small remote holding on the far edge of the estate, given a cottage and a bare pittance, and there she would live out her days in exactly the obscurity she had tried to sentence Alohan to, forgotten, unimportant, minding no one's fate but her own. It was mercy. It was also, everyone privately agreed, a punishment more exquisite than any jail, for a woman whose only love had ever been power. She was led away without another word. She did not deserve one, and she did not get one, and the chapel felt cleaner when she was gone. Then it was only the family left, for that was what they were now. Alohan understood with a small shock. A family. She and Delphine walked out into the clean-washed morning together, and sat on the low wall above the cove, as they had sat as children, and they talked. Truly talked, for the first time in 3 years, about the letters, the lies, the 2 lonely lives their aunt had built for them out of the wreck of the truth. Delphine wept and laughed, and begged forgiveness for a wedding she'd never understood the cruelty of, and Alohan gave it freely because there was nothing to forgive. They had both been children in a spider's house, and neither had spun the web. "Promise me one thing," Delphine said, leaning her golden head on her sister's shoulder as the gulls wheeled over the bright water. "Anything. Be happy, loudly, where I can see it." Delphine smiled. "I have spent 3 years watching you go gray and calling it dignity. I want to watch you go bright again." And Alaric found Alohan, alone, later, in the little walled garden where the household had last kept them apart, and there was no housekeeper now to summon him away, and no lie left standing between them. For a while neither spoke. They stood among the roses in the washed morning light, and the 3 lost years stood with them, but gently now, the way old grief stands beside you once its teeth are drawn. "I have thought," he said at last, "of all the things I would say to you, if ever I had the chance. For 3 years I rehearsed them. And now that you are here, I find I have only the plainest one left." He turned to face her. "I let you go once because I believed a lie, and because I was too proud and too broken to fight for the truth." He took both her hands in his. "I will not do it again. Not for pride, not for grief, not for any lie the world can invent. Whatever comes, whatever anyone says, whatever the years try to take, I will not let you go again. I swear it to you." Eloan looked up at him, at the man carved from granite, who had learned at terrible cost how to feel again. "I spent 3 years believing I was unwanted," she said quietly. "You spent 3 years believing the same. She built us each a little prison out of the other's silence, and we each lived in it alone, not 30 miles apart." She pressed his hands. "I don't want to spend one more day of my life in a prison built of things left unsaid, so I will say it plainly too, Alaric, and only once, and then never doubt it again. I never stopped, not for a single gray morning. Of those 3 years, I never once stopped. I know," he said, and this time it was true. Spring came late that year to the Cornish coast, but when it came all at once, the cliffs greening, the gorse blazing gold, and along every terrace and wall of Merrowcourt a haze of small blue flowers, forget-me-nots, thousands of them, planted fresh that season by a duke who had at last remembered how. And on a bright morning in May, the chapel bells rang out over the cove for a wedding, the right one this time. Eloan Ashby walked up the aisle of the little gray chapel in a gown the color of the flowers, her dark hair uncovered, her gray-green eyes bright and unafraid. There was no shadow left in her step, no companion's apology in the set of her shoulders. She had her name back and her fortune restored to the last penny and set right by the dowager's lawyers. She had her sister, she had a home. But more than any of it, she had the thing her aunt had tried to steal 3 years ago at a cold writing desk, and had only, in the end, delayed. For love that is true does not die when it is buried. It waits. It waits under the ground through every long winter, patient as a seed for the tide to turn and the light to come back. At the altar, the Duke, who had once let her go, stood waiting for her, but there was nothing of surrender in his face now, nothing of stone, nothing of the grieving ghost who had stared out of a library window at a gray sea. He was smiling, openly, helplessly, the way he had slowly relearned to do this last half-year, like a man recovering the use of a limb he had thought lost for good. When he saw her, he forgot, for a moment, all his ducal gravity, and simply watched her come to him as though he could not believe his fortune, and did not intend to waste a second of it pretending otherwise. Beside him, in a small blue dress, scattering forget-me-nots from a basket with fierce concentration, stood Wren, who chattered now endlessly, making up for 2 years of silence, and who had 3 weeks ago slipped her hand into Eloan's and said, testing the word out shyly. Mama and Eloan had had to kneel down in the passage and hold her a long while before she could trust her own voice to answer. The Dowager Duchess Rosamond sat in the front pew, upright and triumphant, in a hat of quite unreasonable size, dabbing her eyes and pretending she was not. Delphine stood as her sister's maid of honor, radiant beside a shy young curate from the next parish whose eyes had a way of finding her across a room. But that is another story, and a happy one, and it can wait. And when the vicar spoke the words, "If any man can show just cause, and let the silence hang," there was this time no crash of doors, no lie waiting in the wings. There was only the sea beyond the walls, patient and enormous, and the blue flowers nodding at the windows, and a woman and a man who had crossed 3 years of engineered darkness to stand, at last, in the light together. Afterward they walked down through the terraced gardens to the wall above the cove, the 3 of them. The great bright water spread out below, blue and gold and gentle now, as though it had never in its life flung a storm at anyone. "Do you remember," Alaric said, "what I gave you the first time I asked?" Eloan laughed, a real laugh, loud and unguarded, the kind Delphine had made her promise, and bent and picked a small blue flower from the wall. and pressed it into his hand as he had once pressed a whole, crushed fistful into hers on a windy evening a lifetime ago. "Forget-me-nots," she said, as though we ever could have. He closed his fingers over the flower and over her hand both. The sea had taken so much from them. Her mother and her father, his brother. Poor, gentle Ginevra, 3 whole years of 2 lives that should have been spent together. But the sea, in the end, gives back what it takes, if only you can wait for the tide. And the great cold house that had been a place of forged letters and locked boxes and a child's terrible stillness was cold no longer. It was warm with a small girl's endless chatter, and loud with an old woman's laughter, and full to the rafters with a love that had been buried alive and had grown up through the dark. Anyway, like a blue flower forcing its way up through solid stone toward the light, because that is simply what such things do. Wren tugged at Eloin's hand and pointed out at the water, saying something, and then everything, and then anything at all. 2 years of unspent words come tumbling out of her all at once, her voice as bright and tireless as the chapel bell. And Eloin Ashby, who had come back to Merrow Court only for her sister's wedding, and had stayed for the whole of her own life, gathered her husband and her daughter close against her in the clean sea wind, and was at long and hard-won last, loudly and openly and unmistakably happy.